Marion, since we're sitting here in your writing space, I'd like to start by asking you how and when you write and whether that's changed over the years.
Yes, I suppose it has changed, really. I realised in my 50s I had a huge amount of energy and could do a lot of things. And that was when I was chair of the literature board. And that took up a lot of time. And a bit like hanging, you know, Dr. Johnson said the thing about hanging is it concentrates the mind wonderfully. And having something like that to do concentrates the mind. So in my 50s, I really did do a lot of work and thought about things a lot. In my 60s, I calmed down a bit. And now I just sort of potter through work in a very calm way. I mean, I sort of work a lot of the time, but not very fast. I do a lot of reading too. I think that's a fabulous alibi for reading. I mean, I write books, I review books, so of course I've got to read, and quite often that's what I feel like doing.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, you started writing in your 40s, so...
I started writing in my late 30s.
Oh, late 30s.
I'd been fiddling about before. Yeah. I'd done quite a lot when I was a teenager, and it always interests me to look back and see how I could make a guinea for a poem when I was 15. Which was a lot of money. It's what you paid a specialist doctor. Think of how much that'd be these days. And but nobody seemed to think that was something you could do for a living. But when I was getting close to my 40th birthday, I thought, you've got to stop thinking you're going to be a writer one day and do it now.
So what was the catalyst? Was it the birthday?
It was the birthday. It was coming up to that. So the year I turned 40, I sent out stories, and I had 3 published. The first 3 in Quadrant, The Bulletin and Southerly, I think, were all accepted, which was a bit stunning because about the next 28 were all rejected. And if it had happened the other way round, well, I'd probably have given up then and there. But having these 3 accepted was very exciting, so I felt that I'd started. And then I was 47 when my first novel came out. So I'd been trying to publish a collection of short stories. And finally UQP said, what we really want's a novel. So I thought, oh, all right, I'll write a novel. So I sat down and wrote a novel. And they did that first, and then they did the short stories.
So, as a mother of 3 young children myself, also writing and editing, I'd love to know what that time was like when you started writing and you also had children.
I did.
What the balance was like for you of the writing and the motherhood.
It was very, very funny, really. I mean, I was, how old was I? 34 when my younger child went to school, and I thought, this is the moment. I'm going to be a writer now. This is my time. And a job came and got me that I didn't really want. It was a very good job, a part-time teaching job, and I thought, well, it's only part-time, I'll have the rest of the time. I wrote a lot of short stories in that time. I get very cross when people say short stories are practice for a novel, because I don't think they are. I think they're an art form in their own way. But they are something you can do with less time, because I think a lot of a short story happens outside the actual writing of it, and you've got to, they start before they start and finish after they finish, as you would know. And so I think that short stories were good to write with when your time was broken up. I was only part-time teaching, but it took chunks out of every day somehow. And I remember I'd take the kids to music and I'd sit in the car making notes and writing things down and so on. And then the big difference for me was in 1979 when we extended the house and put this room on, and you know, it's Virginia Woolf's A Room of Your Own. It just made all the difference. I had this space to write. I'd tried different things. I'd write on the dining room table. It was absolutely hopeless because you had to clean up every day. Every time you wanted a meal, you had to clean it off. I tried putting the 2 kids in one bedroom, and that wasn't such a good idea. I tried writing in my own bedroom, but as you can see, I'm a messy writer. I like a lot of junk around. I like to have things that I can look at and find. And I'm always interested when people want to go to places like Varuna, because I don't want to do that. I want to stay here and do my writing. The space is hugely important to me. So it was then, and then shortly after that, I suppose, in the mid-80s, I stopped having a job at all. I got a literature board grant and took a year off. And I thought, okay, I'll see if I can do without a job and just make money writing. And I'd do any, I mean, I was an absolute hack writer. If somebody asked me to write this or that, I'd do it. I never said no to anything, and did a lot of odds and sods of things. Now I say no to everything. I only want to do what I want to do, sort of thing. And that was good. So, and that by that time, of course, the kids were growing up, because when your children are little, it seems like an endless time before they'll be very big, but it's actually not very long. They grow up quite fast, and by the time they're 12 and 14, they're around. You have to talk to them, things, but they're not kind of the sort of constant thing they are when they're 3 or 4. I mean, my 4-year-old granddaughter, you know, when she's around, you just have to talk to her all the time. She's talking to you, you've got to talk back. It's extremely conversational.
And she's very sweet.
She is very sweet. She's gorgeous.
Tell us about the Seven Writers group, because in the 80s and 90s you were part of that group, and
I was.
It's taken on since then a kind of legendary status.
It has, and I think probably quite properly so, because there are a lot of groups that tried to form and failed. And it is interesting how that worked. I think different people wanted different things from it. I was very reluctant to join in the first place. I thought, no, I don't need this. I think writing's something I have to do for myself. And I still, to an extent, feel that you've got to sit down and work it out. But what I really loved about the group was that it kind of kept you going. It was the competition, really. You'd have these meetings once a month, and you'd go along, and so-and-so would have sent a story here, or so-and-so would have had a story accepted there. We were all pretty much writing stories. Some people were doing novels. Dorothy Johnston was publishing novels. And just this sense that people were doing it, and it was hugely motivating. That was what was important for me. I'd take stuff and people would read it and make comments, but after a while that was less important to me, because I kind of worked out what sort of thing that people were going to say. That, you know, so-and-so would say, sentences are too long, and somebody else would say, you've got too many words. And so that was less important to me than the notion of colleagues, people you could talk to, because I think that's important in people's jobs often. That, I mean, a good job is one where you've got good colleagues that you talk to and who are supportive in the work you do, and that was great, you know. I liked that. Yeah, and as we all started to publish, we got, you know, interested in one another's work, and of course people were having sad things happen, marriages were breaking up, or children would be sick, and that was a big thing. You'd go along and say, oh, you know, my child's doing this or that, and somebody would say, oh, well, yes, of course they always do that, or whatever. So that was good, and then it kind of sort of wore out, I think. We didn't
went
have
for quite a long time.
Went for a long time, yes. Marion Eldridge died, and Sarah Dowse went to Canada. That's really, and that left only 5 people, which was possibly not quite enough. And people were bringing things to meetings less. And I said, well, this doesn't matter. We can still have meetings and we can talk about things. We can have more abstract conversations about things like, say, character or plot or this or that. But other people didn't really want that. They wanted to have work that was looked at and read, and by that stage I was not really, it didn't seem to be working for me to do that. So I think it had its heyday and it was great, and then it sort of stopped in an amicable fashion.
I think one of the reasons why people are so fascinated by it is because you all were successful, and also I think a lot of writers want to find that group of supportive,
yes,
you know,
yes,
colleagues to be
yes.
with. So those two things combined
were terrific, and it was a very gentle and kind. It was not. It was firm. It would say things. Somebody would say, "Look, this is not really working," and this and that. And what about this? And there'd be questions, but it was never cruel. And I remember talking to somebody who'd been in a group who said the criticism was absolutely slashing and horrendous, and it really kind of quite broke your heart. Whereas I think we were all at a stage where we understood that you're writing. I mean, it's your heart's blood kind of thing. You've got to be kind to people about it. You've got to try and help them to get it to be better, but you can't be too cruel about it.
Now let's get to your essay that's included in Invisible Thread, called Luminous Moments, and it captures many of the themes in your writing. So I'd love you to tell us a bit about it, and also what sparked it, whether it was the Bonnard exhibition, for example, that you refer to.
Well, it was the Bonnard exhibition, and in fact somebody got me to go and do a kind of gallery talk, sitting in front of a Bonnard painting. You know how people, well, I think they had supper and stuff too. It was quite a fancy occasion, as I recollect, and talk about Bonnard. So I do love. There was a Bonnard exhibition, I suppose it was 2002, 3 perhaps, and I do love Bonnard's paintings, and so the talk was called Luminous Moments, and then I started thinking about it and realising that this idea of the luminous moment was what really interests me in writing and in life too, and that quotation. Well, it's not a quotation, but that bit that I refer to, which is in Spider Cup, where the woman whose husband's left her remembers being in a place 5 years ago when they were still a complete family, and they'd had a meal in a restaurant, and they were standing on a bridge looking at a piece of water, and she thinks this scene still exists, this luminous moment is still there. If you could go far enough out into space, 5 years away, it's still happening, which I think is a very interesting image. I feel very strongly that you have to remember the past, that the luminous moments are important. I mean, I've had quite a lot of losses in my life. I mean, my husband died, my daughter died, this year my sister died, breaking my heart, because she was 7 years younger than me, and I was expecting her, you know, just to be there for the rest of my life to talk to. So you're very conscious that that you must remember these moments and not lose them. And this is what Bonnard's doing. And the amazing image of his painting, of course, is that he painted his girlfriend, Martha, or his lover, Martha, and he eventually did marry her, but he painted her for 20 or 30 years, and she was young and beautiful all the time. She never grew old, and that was clearly how he saw her. And apparently as time passed, she got a kind of, this is kind of quite awful, but she got some sort of skin disease, and so she got relief for this by lying in the bath. So he did a lot of pictures of her in the bath, but she's also lying on the bed, and there's this beautiful kind of gleaming bottom that she's got, and he obviously just loved that. And then there are the children sitting at the table, and you think about the fact that these children are dead now, and it's their children who are quite old who are being asked permission to use these paintings and these photographs of their parents as children. And there's this wonderful painting of his of people sitting around a table, and there's a dish with a fish on it, and you can't tell from the painting whether it's a real fish or a painted fish. And I love that. And there's quite often a cat sitting on the table. And I do mention the fact that when we were in France, we used to go to museums and so on and drag the kids around and say, now look at the pictures and decide which one you like best, and we'll buy a postcard of it. And they were taken in by this. It was quite impressive for quite a long time. They'd look at everything and then they'd go and buy a postcard. And they had a postcard of the cat sitting on the table, the Bonnard cat. And of course, they loved that because it was subversive. They knew that, I mean, our cat was always trying to sit on the table, and we were always trying to stop it sitting on the table. So it was the kind of personal memory of this child who'd bought this postcard. And so it was all linked up with my sense of the past and how you must try to remember it. Because I think we have a habit of living in the future, and it's kind of necessary. You think of a book like this, that we're thinking it's going to be launched on this date and it's going to be in the shops in this date. We're always looking to the future and what's going to happen. But I think that it's important for our lives to think of past moments as still existing, as still there, that and of course, you know, your children are young and they're still living at home, but when your children get big and they leave home or they die or something and the family no longer exists, to be able to have it existing still in words on the page or in an image in your head or a photograph in an album is important. Because I think moments are always important, and quite often things go wrong in marriages too, and people get divorced and separate, and I think it's really important in those occasions to remember that it wasn't always like that there was a time when it was good.
And I love that idea in the context of this anthology, obviously, because what we've been trying to do is find those luminous moments from the last 100 years.
Yes.
So, I mean, it's the perfect end to the book, and your piece is placed at the end. But in this piece you write very beautifully about Canberra, and that is something, you know, that you're well known for, really looking at the kind of daily nuances of life here in Canberra, whereas most people think of Canberra as just being about the politics. And in fact you are a writer who seems very confident setting work in Canberra, whereas a lot of writers don't want to do that. Why do you think that is?
Well, it's considered a bit the kiss of death, I think. 7 writers did do an anthology called Canberra Tales, which we thought was a good title because it suggested pilgrimages, Canterbury Tales, Chaucer, all sorts of, you'd think, serious connections. And Penguin said it sold extremely well in Canberra and not well anywhere else. And in fact, Paul Daly has just written the Canberra book in the series that New South's done. You know, they've done Melbourne, Sydney, Hobart, Adelaide. He's done Canberra. And he came and talked to me and said, well, what about writing about Canberra? And well, I was interested in his book because he's a journalist and he comes very much from a political point of view, which I don't. For me, well, the politics is sort of over there. I see it on the television, but I don't live it. I don't know it. I've never really had much connection with the public service and the sorts of jobs that people do in connection with government. And I've found that people like to read about Canberra. A lot of people with my Apricot Kernel novels, which are very much set in Canberra, said, I love reading about Canberra. I love seeing it as a place that that I didn't know, that I'm finding out about. The point, too, people liked a lot. They liked the idea of the lake because that's a sort of recurring image of people looking at the lake and its different lights and its different modes and things. And a whole lot of people said to me, "Oh, I know that lake so well, but it had never occurred to me to think of it in that way." So that was quite exciting. So I don't think that I have any problem setting books in Canberra. I wouldn't put Canberra in the title. No, I wouldn't do that. But and of course they're not usually just in Canberra. They're often in Newcastle or in Paris or Sydney as well. So I don't put all the eggs in one basket.
Well, speaking of Paris, you've lived there, and I mean, Paris is a city where if you say you've lived in Paris, people sort of swoon with jealousy. Not so Canberra.
No, they don't, do they?
But you've chosen to live here. So as a writer, what is it that's attractive about this place to you?
Oh, there's a kind of peacefulness and calm in it, which is terrific for a writer. And I love the light. Look at the light here. It's just fantastic. And you can look out and see the hills and the trees and so on. And it's not too hard to get around. And I love the National Library and the gallery and all those things. I mean, when my husband died, people said, "Oh, well, you'll sell this house and move somewhere smaller." Well, no, I wasn't going to do that. And they said, "Well, will you go back to Newcastle?" Which I left when I was 21. And I did think about that quite seriously, as one does in those circumstances. But then I realised that none of my contemporaries were still in Newcastle, or I didn't know them if they were. I mean, I'm sure there are a lot of my contemporaries in Newcastle, but I no longer knew them. And my relations had all kind of probably died, I think, is what had happened to them, or I no longer knew them. And anyway, I just like this sense of these big national institutions that are there. I miss the sea. That's the thing that I miss in Canberra. But I love the weather, especially as I see it from the study most of the time. I don't have to go out into it. If I had to get up at go out at 7 o'clock in the morning to go to work, I might think the weather was a different matter. But from here, looking out into the sun, it's pretty nice.
Now, you were on the advisory committee for The Invisible Thread, and so together we read through the work of 150 writers.
We did indeed.
So after going through that process, what was your overall impression of writing from the region?
That it was an amazing thing, really. I can't imagine many places where you'd find that sort of variety and quality of writing, really. I suppose if you were doing a book of a Sydney anthology or a Melbourne anthology, you'd find a lot of stuff. But there just seems to me something about Canberra. Does it turn people into writers, or is it a place that makes writers want to come? I remember once in the early days of the Word Festival, somebody organised for us to write a piece for the Qantas magazine, I think it was, to advertise the Word Festival. And I remember I was the person who got lumbered with this task, and inviting a whole lot of people to come to University House and tell me why, as writers, they wanted to live in Canberra. And Dorothy Green was one person, and Jeff Page was there. I think Mark O'Connor came. There were about 7 or 8 people, can't quite remember who they all were now, and they all said, "Oh, it's the light. We like the light here. We like the peacefulness of the life. It's a good place to write in." And perhaps you could say, if you were being mean, that not a lot happens, so you can sit down and do your writing. But you see, I don't think you need a lot happening to be a writer. There's a wonderful quotation here from somebody talking about Bonnard, that he discovered strange and wonderful countries even in boudoirs and drawing rooms. And I say, I wonder that he would need to say even. Where else are strange and wonderful countries to be found, if not in those places where people live and have their being and think and use their imaginations? And I think Canberra's a good place to use your imagination.
Absolutely. So tell us about the gems that you, because we all discovered some gems of writing during the process. What were the ones that really struck you?
Well, of course, a lot of them I already knew. I like Brissenden's Depot Beach poem. I thought that Dorothy Green's Pawn Birds was great fun. Pawn birds being as in thorn birds.
Yes.
I loved the piece of Marjorie Barnard on Christmas.
Yeah.
But it's set in the 1930s and it's Christmas in the Hall of Residence. And to me it captures a bit of the feel of Canberra when I came here in 1962. People still lived in, not halls of residence, hostels. People still lived in hostels and had that kind of slightly odd life. And I just feel that she captures a Canberra that's vanished. That, I mean, that hostel life has gone now. I mean, when I was teaching first at Canberra High in the early 60s, and a whole lot of people lived in places like Havelock House. And so Havelock House would provide all your meals. It looked after you brilliantly. But on Friday nights, they'd have fry pans in their rooms and have big cook-ups. And it was kind of dormy feast stuff. That was really weird. My husband, when he was living in Bruce Hall when I met him, he came to Canberra, was put up in Bruce Hall, and then they moved into the Hotel Acton, which was a very posh hostel. And you had 3-course meals there. Quite often the first course would be something like tinned spaghetti or something, but anyway. Then you sat at table and you had linen napkins and you got waited on and
waited on with tinned spaghetti. Sounds rather odd.
It was very funny, but it was a whole other world that people lived in, and of course in that Marjorie Barnard story, there's a family. A husband and wife and a grown-up daughter living there, which is very peculiar. So it's just those little, I don't know, little windows into the past fascinate me quite a lot. And I think we get a few of them here. What else? What else am I thinking of? Some of the non-fiction bits are fascinating. I was interested in how much war history came out of Canberra. That was another intriguing thing. And of course it starts off with Bean and his histories, but there are other people who are writing the same kind of thing. But mainly it's just such a variety. It was hard, wasn't it?
It was really hard, yeah.
And of course we had those fascinating arguments about the equivalences of fiction and poetry, you know. If you've got one piece of fiction, should a poet have sort of 4 poems or something? And I think, I mean, it was your executive decision, I think, to say 1 piece from each person, which was the really good thing to do. That was, you know, 1 poem's of course worth 1,000 words of fiction. Yes.
And in fact, I mean, one of the poems in there, David Campbell's poem, which is just 8 lines, but I mean, what an incredible poem.
Well, exactly. And that stays in your mind.
Absolutely.
You could practically memorise it, couldn't you?
Yeah.
Whereas somebody might prose on for pages and not be nearly as memorable.
I think we could talk all afternoon, but one final question. Speaking of the past, when you look back on your career so far, what do you see?
Oh, what do I see? I suppose in some ways I see great good luck. That as a child I wanted to be a writer, as a young person I wanted to be a writer. If I had a regret, it was that I didn't get organised to do it. You know, at a Tim Winton-ish sort of age. What was I doing? I mean, I was sort of fiddling around. In other ways, I don't regret that, because I do think that the older you get, the more you've got to say. I think a lot of young people write 1 book and then they think, oh, no, I'm a writer, I've got to write another book, but what am I going to write it about? So that being a late starter, you have this sense of richness, that there's immense numbers of topics to write about. So I think I have been lucky in that I've always got published. It seemed very hard work at the beginning, and I think that's a bit like childbirth. You forget, because you wouldn't do it again if you didn't forget. The first years of, between when I first sent some stories to UQP in 1987, when they published my first novel, that was a long and painful and terrible time, because you just didn't know if you were going to make it work or not. But since then, I've had no trouble getting published. It's just gone on happening. I wouldn't mind selling as many as, say, Kate Morton, but then that's not going to happen, so I've got used to that. I have good readers. They don't always buy my books. They borrow them from the library quite often, so I get good PLR. But I have a lot of response from readers who say that my books are important to them, and I think that's what a writer really wants, readers. And so in that sense, I've been lucky to have good readers.